Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled The Natural Gas Gamble, Addressing Our Growing Reliance on Natural Gas for Electricity. My name is Erin Cameron, and I'm the Development and Outreach Coordinator for Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. A few housekeeping items before we get started today, and then I'll hand it over to our presenters. To ensure sound quality, all the attendee lines will be muted throughout the presentation, but we really encourage you to please type in any questions you may have in the questions box on your control panel, and we will answer those questions at the very end of the presentation today. For those of you not familiar with Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and I want to thank any of our members on this call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website, www.cleanenergy.org. And now, to lead us through the presentations, today I'd like to introduce Susan Glickman, SACE Florida Director. Susan?
Yes, thank you, Erin. Good afternoon. I'm Susan Glickman. I'm the Florida Director of Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and I'll be facilitating our webinar today. Today we are discussing a new report from the Union of Concerned Scientists called The Natural Gas Gamble, a risky bet on America's clean future. Here in the Southeast, a number of states have seen significant increases since 2007 in their reliance on natural gas. In fact, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists report, 5 southern states rank in the top 10 among states with the most increases in gas dependence between 2007 and 2013. I will be talking later about some specific concerns that we have with the overdependence on natural gas in Florida. But to walk us through the details of the report that covers the entire region, we will be hearing from Sandra Sattler and Steve Klemmer, who are both co-authors on the report. And let me introduce them. I'm going to start with Steve. Steve is the UCS Director of Energy Research and Analysis, and he conducts research on the economic and environmental benefits of implementing renewable energy technologies and policies at the state and national level. He also directs UCS's research on coal, natural gas, and nuclear power, and on solutions to reduce carbon emissions and water use in the electricity sector. Steve holds an MS in Energy Analysis and Policy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a BA in Political Science and History from Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota. And also we're going to hear from Sandra Sattler. Sandra is UCS's Senior Energy Modeler in the Climate and Energy Program. She analyzes and models clean energy, energy efficiency, and global warming policies at the state, regional, and national level. She also quantifies the energy, economic, environmental, and public health impacts that the policies would have on our society. Ms. Sattler joined UCS in 2008 after earning her doctorate in mechanical engineering at Cornell University. She holds a BS in mechanical engineering from Columbia and a BA in mathematics and physics from Whitman College. So without any further ado, I will turn that over to Steve Klemmer.
All right, thanks a lot, Susan. Let me first say that I'd like to congratulate the folks in the Southeast, the victory that Duke had last night over my alma mater where I went to grad school, University of Wisconsin-Madison. It was a close game, but the Badgers ended up faltering in the end. So congratulations to anyone from North Carolina and the region, I guess. So let me start by saying that I guess the way this presentation is going to go about the results of our report, first I'm going to talk about some of the key reasons driving the recent increase in natural gas generation at the state and national level, along with some of the benefits and risks that go along with that transition. And then I'm going to pass it over to Sandra to talk about some of the results of some national modeling we did that looks at different electricity futures in the United States and the role that gas and other resources would play in those futures. And then she's going to pass it back to me to close with a discussion of some of the implications and recommendations from the report. So next slide, please. So this slide shows the trend that's occurred over the last 6 years in the United States transitioning away from coal towards natural gas and renewables, as natural gas is the primary fuel, but also renewables to a certain extent. There's several reasons to explain this trend, including higher coal prices, public health standards that are aimed at limiting harmful pollution from coal plants, sharp declines in natural gas prices driven primarily by the shale gas boom, and also on the renewable side, some of the rapid growth in the renewable energy technologies has gone along with declining costs and state and federal policies that have all contributed to this transition away from coal. Along with energy efficiency has also played a role too. You can see that coal generation declined from 48% of the power supply in 2007 to 39% in 2013. Most of that was made up with an increase in gas generation, but you can also see that the power supply from renewables also doubled, from non-hydro renewables also doubled over that period. In over 65 years of record keeping, coal generation has never dropped below 40% of the power supply until 2012. Next slide, please. And this trend is projected to continue into the future. This slide shows an analysis we did back in 2013 called Right for Retirement, where we found that 641 coal generators with a capacity of about 100 gigawatts could be retired in the next 5 to 10 years. And this is about 1/3 of the US coal fleet and represents about 10% of the country's electricity use. This includes about 41,000 megawatts or 41 gigawatts of announced retirements, which you can see on this map in the green circles, and 59 gigawatts that we determined in our analysis to be economically vulnerable, mainly because they were lacking, those generators were lacking important pollution control equipment, and those are shown in the dark blue circles. The light blue circles show coal units that would continue to remain operating. As you can see from the map, most of the units from that analysis were concentrated in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mid-Atlantic, which is not surprising because that's where the bulk of the country's coal capacity is located. Next slide, please. But our analysis also showed that when you take it down from the state level or build it up from the generator level, that the utilities that had the most capacity that was economically vulnerable in our analysis were located in the Southeast. And you can see that Southern Company and TVA and Duke all were the top 3 on our list of utilities with the most amount of capacity that was vulnerable. And you can see that on the far right, these utilities have also made some announcements for units that they were going to retire in the next 5 years or so, and some of those retirements have already occurred. So these numbers are from 2013, as I said, so they may be have changed a little bit since then, but I don't think the overall ranking and message has changed. Next slide, please. And this just gives you some examples of some of the older, inefficient, and higher emitting coal plants that are slated for retirement in the Southeast. For example, TVA is closing 8 units in Alabama and Kentucky and plans to replace that with a new natural gas plant at their Paradise site in Kentucky. Next slide, please. And this gets to what Susan was mentioning in her intro, that in the report we also look at what's happening at the state level. And this shows that several states are growing even faster in terms of their reliance on gas generation in their mix compared to those national averages I showed you earlier. There's 20 states that we showed in the report that have increased the share of their natural gas in their power supply by at least 5 percentage points between 2007 and 2013, including 8 states in the Southeast. And then you can see with in the red, 7 states have actually increased the share of gas by more than 15 percentage points, with 6 of the top 7 located in the Southeast. And that's Georgia was the highest ranking state, which ranks second, and increased their gas generation by 23 percentage points between 2007 and 2013. Next slide, please. And this slide shows the total amount of gas in the power supply in 2013. 16 states generated at least a third of their electricity from gas in 2013, and 9 states generated more than 50%. And you can see Florida and Mississippi both at over 60%, Georgia at 34%, but as I said on the last slide, Georgia actually increased theirs from 11% to 34% over that time period. Next slide, please. The recent surge in natural gas is directly attributable to the sharp decline in gas prices that we've seen in recent years, which is largely due to some of the advances in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling techniques that have made more natural gas reserves accessible. Since 2007, you can see in the map, shale gas production has increased more than 6-fold and now accounts for about 40% of total U.S. natural gas production. And the U.S. Energy Information Administration projects that the growth in shale gas production will continue at that pace through about 2040 is how far out their projections go. Next slide, please. So in the report, we talk about both the benefits of this transition to gas as well as some of the risks. So first, let me talk about a few of the benefits. Clearly, as I showed in the first slide, natural gas is displacing coal, and there's clearly some environmental and public health benefits from that, particularly from reduced criteria pollutants, air pollution, and even lower water use at power plants and less water pollution, lower smokestack carbon emissions. Clearly, we've also seen economic development going on, particularly in states that have shale gas development, as well as expanding pipeline capacity like you see in that picture there. The recent reduction in gas prices has also led to lower electricity prices, which is a benefit to consumers. And gas is clearly a much more flexible resource than either coal or nuclear plants, and has provided a lot of increased flexibility to the grid that will be also helpful in integrating more renewable energy sources. Next slide, please. Of course, the rush to gas also carries a number of complex and serious risks. Next slide, please. Chief among them is really around some of the price volatility risks and the impact that has on consumers, the economy, and even the environment. Over the last decade, you can see from this graph, we've seen significant price volatility in the U.S. Due to the nature of its production, storage, and transmission, the fact that it has that it supplies many end uses, its susceptibility to extreme weather events. The price of natural gas tends to fluctuate more than does the price of its competitors. And those elevated costs are typically passed directly on to consumers. The increase in natural gas prices that we saw most recently around in January of 2014, due primarily to cold weather and the polar vortex, actually resulted in a slight shift back to coal in that year, which also has implications for emissions and the environment. Some of the other reasons for the price spikes, particularly in 2005 and 2008, had to do with hurricane activity in the Gulf. Katrina and Rita, Gustav and Ike resulted in a lot of gas production from the Gulf of Mexico that wasn't available, that had ripple effects throughout the country. Since 2007, 2008, since we've had the shale gas boom, that's definitely been a benefit in terms of relieving some of that price pressure, as you can see from sort of the declining prices that we've seen since then. But it still hasn't eliminated the price volatility, which we've continued to see, particularly most recently from the polar vortex. Next slide, please. And like all fossil fuels, burning natural gas for electricity generation also results in the release of CO2 and contributes to global warming. Smokestack emissions from natural gas combustion are about 50 to 60% lower than coal, but the extraction and distribution and storage of gas also results in methane leakage, which is about a greenhouse gas that's about 34 times stronger than CO2 over a 100-year period. And increasing our reliance on gas could delay the deployment of renewables, putting us at greater risk of failing to meet the emission levels that we need to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. Next slide, please. There's also important environmental and public health risks with natural gas production, particularly with hydraulic fracturing. Some of these risks include potential contamination of drinking water supplies from the chemicals and water that get injected into the wells for fracking, some of the air pollution from the natural gas operations, including a lot of the truck traffic that goes back and forth from these sites to transport water and both to and from the site. Continuing to increase the nation's dependence on gas is going to exacerbate these risks while delaying the transition to a low-carbon electric power system. Next slide, please. Fortunately, where natural gas comes up short on some of these issues, renewable energy and energy efficiency can deliver. These technologies are already ramping up rapidly across the U.S. and demonstrating that they can deliver affordable, reliable, and low-carbon power. But to fully capitalize on the promise of renewable energy and to minimize the risks associated with an overdependence on gas, we must make smart decisions today. Our analysis explores the costs and benefits of these different energy futures in the transition to a low-carbon economy. At this point, I'm going to pass it over to Sandra to talk about the results of our modeling that we did for this report. Sandra?
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. So our analysis explored several different energy pathways to transition away from coal and to prioritize renewable energy and energy efficiency. Specifically, we looked at 3 different scenarios. A business as usual scenario. That scenario assumes all current state and federal policies. A carbon standard scenario that analyzes the impacts of a carbon emissions reduction standard. So that carbon standard scenario would be something like a carbon cap or a carbon price. And then finally, a scenario with a carbon standard and renewable and efficiency policies. So layering on federal renewable energy and energy efficiency policies onto that previous scenario. So this was this final scenario was our core policy case with a 25% renewable energy standard by 2025. And a 15% energy efficiency resource standard by 2025. To model these scenarios, we use the U.S. Department of Energy model, the National Energy Modeling System, which was developed by the Energy Information Administration. NEMS is an economy-wide energy model that forecasts energy use and emissions from the electric, transportation, industrial, and building sectors. UCS uses a modified version of the NEMS model where we use a NEMS model, but we also revise the initial assumptions. We revise things like cost and performance assumptions of power plants. So we use this model to model these scenarios. For this analysis, we also focus specifically on the electricity sector. So we ran the 3 scenarios that I just described, business as usual, carbon standard, and our core policy case, using our version of the NEMS model. We see in the results of the business as usual scenario that the United States burns more natural gas in 2040 than now. The level of renewables also increases throughout the projection to meet growing energy demand. There's an initial dip in coal generation, so if you look in 2020, there's a little dip in coal there due to low natural gas prices and the retirement of some older plants. But the model also projects that coal use rebounds somewhat in the later years because of rising natural gas prices and because of growing electricity demand. In this scenario, we see that natural gas prices increase through the projection. The power sector natural gas prices are 2.3 times higher in 2040 than 2013, and average consumer natural gas prices double by the end of the projection. Looking at our core policy scenario, so the carbon standard with renewables and efficiency policies, what we see is a cleaner and more diverse generation mix towards the end of the projection. Under this scenario, the share of non-hydro renewables grows sixfold to 39% of total generation by 2040, and energy efficiency reduces electricity demand by 16%. And that also the share of natural gas generation in this scenario remains mostly constant through the projection. Also in our core policy scenario, gas and coal-fired generation is replaced with renewables and efficiency. So this scenario results in a total electricity mix portfolio that is less sensitive to long-term fluctuation in fossil fuel prices. So what does this mean for emissions? Well, our business as usual scenario shows that the recent decline in emissions won't continue without additional policies. By 2040, carbon emissions are projected to rise 12% above 2013 levels because of growing energy demand, because of continued coal use, and an increase in natural gas generation. A carbon standard alone, so that's the light green line on this graph, would lead to lower reductions than our core policy case. And they would also happen later than when you combine a carbon standard with renewable and efficiency policies. The shaded area that you see in this graph represents total additional emissions that would result from this delay. And so that delay in seeing more renewables and efficiency actually results to 6.8 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. Adding renewable energy and energy efficiency policies onto that carbon standard can reduce power plant carbon emissions 70% below 2005 levels by 2040. Our core policy case also lowers electricity bills. Compared with business as usual or the carbon standard alone, renewables and efficiency policies with a carbon standard would result in deep cuts in carbon emissions and would lower electricity bills by 2030 and through 2040. Looking specifically at the numbers, a carbon standard with renewable energy and energy efficiency policies has impacts on consumer energy bills. It cuts carbon emissions and it raises carbon revenues. In the near term, so if you look at 2020, investments in renewables and efficiency are needed. So consumers would see costs of $19 billion. But annual savings would add up to $40 billion by 2030 and close to $60 billion by 2040. In addition, we also see societal benefits outweighing the costs. In 2020, the societal benefits, so these are health and environmental benefits of reducing carbon emissions, are more than 2.5 times greater than consumer compliance costs, so the incremental costs of deploying the new mix. By 2040, the costs of our core scenario are slightly lower than business as usual, and that's because of lower fuel expenses as we move to renewable energy and energy efficiency. In 2040, in fact, net societal benefits grow to nearly $170 billion. Increasing the share of renewable energy and energy efficiency is an important way to hedge against economic and climate risks in a future that includes uncertain natural gas prices. We ran our 3 scenarios, so that's the business as usual, carbon standard, and our core policy scenario under this, what you see on the right hand, under the range of natural gas price projections. What we found was that combining the carbon standard with renewables and energy efficiency policies helps lower consumer electricity bills and carbon emissions under all the wide range of possible future natural gas price projections. Electricity bills in 2040 are lowest in our core policy scenario compared to the other scenarios. These are under the high price forecast. these results are the results of our analysis. I'm now going to pass this back over to Steve, who will now talk about what these results mean in the context of the Clean Power Plan and the role that natural gas should play in our electricity mix.
Great, thanks, Sandra. Can you move it to the next slide, please? So some of you may be asking, what does this all mean for EPA's Clean Power Plan? Just to make it clear that this analysis was not an analysis of the Clean Power Plan, but it was an analysis of how far we could reduce emissions, and it clearly demonstrates in terms of the amount of emission reductions that we were modeling that it demonstrates that it's cost effective for us to even meet a stronger emission reduction targets with more renewables and efficiency than what's been proposed under EPA's Clean Power Plan. Under the Clean Power Plan, EPA's proposal would reduce emissions 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. Our analysis gets almost twice that amount, a 58% reduction by 2030, and as Sandra said, 70% reduction by 2040. EPA's proposal gives states significant flexibility to meet their targets through four major building blocks. Those include improving heat rates at existing coal plants, coal to gas fuel switching, increasing renewables and nuclear power, and increasing energy efficiency. However, EPA's proposal greatly underestimates the role of renewables. In their analysis, renewables only provided about 12% of the U.S. electricity mix by 2030. This is only slightly higher than what's projected to happen anyways from existing state renewable energy policies. A UCS analysis that we did last fall showed that we could nearly double this amount to about 23% by 2030 based on the real-world experience of states deploying renewable electricity over the last 5 years. And it would allow us to strengthen the overall emission reduction target to achieve a 40% reduction below 2005 levels just from that step alone. This current analysis that we presented today shows that we could go even further, reaching 27% renewables by 2030 with additional federal renewable energy policies. EPA's proposal also relies heavily on fuel switching from coal to gas as one of the pathways for state compliance, and this pathway risks an even greater over-reliance on natural gas in many states. In the report, we give an example for Florida. Of course, this is just a hypothetical scenario, but it shows that if Florida was to fully utilize the pathway according to how EPA defined it and increase the utilization of existing natural gas combined cycle plants to a 70% capacity factor, Florida could depend on natural gas for nearly 90% of its power supply. This would make Florida residents and businesses even more vulnerable to natural gas price volatility and higher electricity prices. And then when you combine this with proposed investments in new pipeline capacity, like the proposed $3 billion Sabal Trail project that would run about 500 miles through Georgia and Florida, this investment in this infrastructure could lock in additional carbon emissions and crowd out investments in renewables and efficiency. At the same time, and this is shown in EPA's analysis as well, Florida and most other states in the Southeast are way behind the rest of the country in implementing energy efficiency programs and deploying renewables, despite having a tremendous potential for both of those resources. EPA's building block analysis actually assumes that the states in the Southeast are going to catch up to the rest of the country in implementing renewables and efficiency, and they include that in their analysis. But in the end, it's really up to the states to decide what role the different resources play in meeting the state emission reduction targets. Next slide, please. We also talk about in the report about how the country can move towards a more balanced and appropriate role for natural gas. With strong climate and energy policies and sufficient regulatory oversight, natural gas could play an important role in a clean energy system, especially if it came to be seen not as a baseload replacement for coal, or a baseload replacement for nuclear, but as an enabler of grid flexibility in support of renewable technologies to help integrate them into the electricity system. There's also many other appropriate uses of gas too. Certainly, it's a really good resource for generating peak electricity use. Using natural gas in efficient combined heat and power systems is a good idea. Eventually, if we're able to develop carbon capture and storage technology, that could be paired with natural gas plants. And certainly, using gas as a source for heating and cooling in homes and businesses is also a good and appropriate use for gas. So next slide, please. So the report closes with some recommendations. This includes adopting and implementing a strong federal carbon standard for power plants, and it's our objective to try to strengthen, in particular, the renewable energy building block. As part of that, we filed comments back on December 1st, along with many other groups and utilities around the country. If folks would like to see some of our recommendations, they're available on our website, and I'd certainly be happy to send them to you as well. But there's certainly room to strengthen other building blocks as well. We also recommend strengthening and enacting strong state and federal clean energy policies. As I said, around the EPA Clean Power Plan, it's really going to be up to the states to decide how much of different types of resources they're going to implement to meet the proposal. And we're certainly hoping that states enact strong efficiency and renewables policies as part of that. Third, we recommend in the report strengthening the regulations that would reduce fugitive methane emissions that's resulting from natural gas production, particularly hydraulic fracturing. And then finally, we talk about how to improve grid operation and resource planning to make sure that we're making the appropriate investments in the right infrastructure going forward, so that we achieve a low carbon energy future and don't lock in carbon emissions from investments that we make today. With that, Sandra, can you move it to the next slide, please? So we would be happy to take questions on the report.
Thank you, Steve. So I'm going to just talk for a couple minutes about Florida, and I think put a kind of practical application to this analysis in this report before we get to questions. And we already have a few questions, so just a reminder that you can type questions into your screen, and we'll take those and propose those to Steve and Sandra in just a minute. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm the Florida Director of Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and I've been working on climate and energy issues for about 15 years here in the state, and have been through a lot of different phases, I suppose, in that at one point in 2005 and 6 and 7, we were fighting coal-fired power plant proposals. There were as many as 7 at the time, and so it is interesting to see the evolution of concerns about coal. The Union Concerned Scientists did a report at that time called Burning Coal, Burning Cash, and now we're looking at natural gas. So the good news about natural gas is that it's half the emissions of coal, and the bad news about natural gas is it's half the emissions of coal. So if we are truly concerned about reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the significant way that scientists tell us we need to do, the natural gas gamble, particularly as it appears for Florida, is actually pretty scary. By way of example, the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in southern Florida is Florida Power and Light's 3,750 megawatt gas plant in the West Palm Beach area. So as I said earlier, I'm really just speaking to concerns about Florida because that's where my expertise is. So let me mention policy, because as I listened to Steve at the end talk about what the recommendations from the report are in terms of policies going forward, Florida is 180 degrees in the wrong direction. Our incentives continue to be completely misaligned when assuming we accept the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, when the four big investor-owned utilities, the monopoly utilities in Florida, that represent roughly 75% of the state, Florida Power and Light, the largest, Duke Energy, Tampa Electric, and Gulf Power, which is part of Southern Companies. The way utilities are regulated in Florida, they get a guaranteed or allowed rate of return on their capital expenditures. So the incentive is on building power plants. And it's a sort of a centralized method of power generation that they own and control, and it's actually sort of understandable from a business point of view why they would want to do that, but we would like to see policymakers balance that with the needs of not only consumers but our natural environment, and taking into account that frankly the world has really changed. And when I say that, I'm talking about the cost for energy. Costs for nuclear power plants have gone through the roof, from $5-6 billion to $25 billion. So something that might have made sense decades ago maybe doesn't make sense anymore. And I think it's the same as we see the decreasing costs about solar. So for energy efficiency in Florida, we have no energy efficiency resource standard. Our goals are ridiculously low. Southern Alliance for Clean Energy has been involved in proceedings back in 2009 and just most recently, the end of 2014, in what's called the Florida Energy Efficiency and Conservation Act, where the Florida Public Service Commission essentially accepted the utilities proposals and the staff recommendations to reduce energy efficiency and conservation goals by more than 90%. They ended the solar rebate program, which was actually part of the, I'll speak more to solar in general, but it was part of the sort of a demand side management aspect to energy, to solar as well. And there are 20 states in the country that get either a percentage to 2.4%. Arizona gets 500 times as much energy efficiency as Florida. If we actually looked at the savings that Florida Power and Light is projecting to get in 2015, if the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, which is very famous for ranking states, Florida's 28th, Florida Power and Light by itself for 2015 alone would be 49th. It's really dismal, and the consumers end up paying more for having their energy need met. And I'll sort of share that within just a couple weeks of gutting the energy efficiency goals, the Florida Public Service Commission voted to approve a new 1,640 megawatt gas plant for Duke Energy. So again, it's understandable why Duke would like to add another major asset and put it in their rate base so they can continue to get a rate of return on that. But it is unfortunate that we do not have discerning regulators at the Public Service Commission who are directed by the Florida legislature. So as for solar, a very similar situation exists. We have no target for solar. We have no renewable portfolio standard. By way of example, Florida Power and Light, our biggest utility, has about 24,000 megawatts of generating capacity, yet they get less than 1/10 of 1% from solar. Their parent company, NextEra, of course, does a lot of solar, but they don't do it necessarily in the state of Florida. They have 110 megawatts currently. They get some biopower, but primarily their renewables have been waste to energy, which is very prevalent in the state of Florida as far as renewables. They have announced another 225 megawatts of utility scale solar. Duke just announced a plan over the next 20 years to do 500 megawatts, and Gulf Power is doing some solar, 125 megawatts at some of the military bases. But in terms of significant amounts of power to replace these coal retirements, Florida is really in a position where we're going to be seeing a lot of coal retirement in the state, just from an aging out of the coal fleet. So we do have an opportunity to meet these needs We are second only to Texas in terms of the coal retirements we are expecting. So there's a fundamental need to see, as we move into the next decades, how we're going to meet our energy need. And the costs for solar have come down so exponentially, and I applaud this. Florida Power & Light's parent company, NextEra, recently signed a power purchase agreement in the TVA region in Alabama at 6.1 cents a kilowatt hour in a power purchase agreement. And I'm generalizing a little bit here, but generally 6.1 cents a kilowatt hour is less than you're going to pay for a new natural gas plant. So we need to be looking at solar in a more efficient way. One of the things that's happened in Florida, maybe it does in other states as well, but there's an enormous amount of resources that go to political campaigns, and that seems to have a lot of influence, the amount of campaign contributions from big utilities here in the state, probably similar elsewhere. So that's it in Florida. We can be doing a lot better, and the fact that we are 62% reliant on gas, and if we meet these greenhouse gas reductions coming to the EPA with more gas, we could be over 90% reliant on natural gas, and that seems to be a very dangerous place for any state to be. So with that, let's ask some questions. There was a first question that came through about your analysis, Steve and Sandra, and what kind of review process, peer review process, did the report go through?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to address that. Yes, we did do some external peer review for this report. It's listed in the acknowledgement section of the report. I wouldn't say that it was as rigorous as submitting a journal article, for example, but we did try to reach out to experts in the field as well as some folks from the national labs to get their review of the report. We also, I think it's also worth mentioning that outside of this report, but the model that we used for this report and the assumptions that went into it have gone through several peer review processes over the years to vet the assumptions and changes that we've made. Sandra just kind of touched on that earlier. We rely heavily on data from actual projects where that's available for certain technologies, and then mid-range projections from other studies, and most of that comes from government agency sources and industry sources. And so we feel like that those assumptions are very, very well vetted. We also, use a lot of EIA's assumptions too in our modeling. For example, the natural gas price forecast and projections that Sandra had showed in one of her slides, those come directly from EIA, as do things like the cost and performance of natural gas and coal plants, things that are technologies that are commercially pretty established, and the data for those are pretty good. So I just wanted to highlight that fact that we did have gone through a lot of peer review on the modeling aspect.
Great. And just as part of that, someone was asking, what is the annual demand growth estimate? I'm not sure that I heard that.
I can address that too, unless you want to, Sandra. I think we basically use EIA's projections for demand growth that are embedded in the model. We're using the Annual Energy Outlook 2013 version of the model. I believe that the load growth nationally, the average is about just under 1% per year, and that's for business as usual. So under the scenario where we implemented energy efficiency policies, that pretty much levels out demand growth in the future.
Steve, there are a couple questions about sort of energy efficiency. If you could just maybe assess, what it means to have a reduction of the energy efficiency goals by more than 90% to previous levels. And I presume you know this, but 5 years ago, the increases, the penalties ultimately were set aside for both FPL and Progress Now Duke. So we were 90% less than already anemic goals. Any comment on how that impact?
On how what?
Well, really on how that'll impact consumers and what they're going to end up paying to build power plants, I presume, when they could be doing energy efficiency. But Any assessment of that?
I wouldn't. I mean, we don't explicitly model that, but what is reflected in the model is existing state energy efficiency and renewable energy policies, and we have this version of the model. I don't think reflects this recent decision to reduce Florida's goals, but we are aware of that and have reflected it in the analyses we're currently working on. And certainly, I would just say that it's certainly moving in the wrong direction in terms of trying to comply with EPA's Clean Power Plan, in which EPA is essentially pointing to states that are leading on energy efficiency and as a way for other states to be able to demonstrate that other states can achieve those targets, and actually factored that into their estimates for the state emission reduction goals. So to the extent that Florida is reducing their efficiency targets, that's just going to mean that it has to come from somewhere else, unless they change course and decide to go the other direction.
A couple more questions. In the states that have seen the largest increase in the use of natural gas to generate electricity, do you have a sense of how much of that change is the result of new natural gas-fired capacity coming online versus greater utilization of existing natural gas plants that are like natural gas peakers moving down kind of the dispatch curve because of the fuel prices having decreased? Do you have a sense of that?
I think it's sort of a combination of both. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips to say how much is coming from each, but certainly over the last several years, as gas prices have come down, we have seen an increase in the dispatch of natural gas combined cycle plants and a reduction in the dispatch of coal plants. And there's still a significant amount of room to go above where we're at right now. I know for Florida, for example, in 2012, when I guess gas was actually a higher percentage of Florida's electricity mix in 2012 than 13, it was closer to 70% or 68%. The natural gas combined cycle fleet was operating at about a 52% capacity factor. And, it's possible to operate those plants at 70 or 80% capacity factor. And in fact, that's what EPA's building block for natural gas is based on. It assumes that states could increase their existing gas plants to a 70% capacity factor and displace coal. That's what they base their calculations on. So there's certainly a lot more room to do that, but there's also new plants that are being built and coming online as well to replace some of the coal retirements and to meet demand growth.
So Steve, I have a couple, and Sandra, a couple other questions. I'll sort of gas. There was one asking about what you think the predictions and sort of impacts are for future natural gas regulations in terms of fracking and the methane emissions. And then as a related comment, one of the listeners said they had kind of a comment to make about referring to methane escaping and greenhouse gas. About the need to broaden that, including ethane, propane, butane, all are in natural gas. So that's just a little bit more of a side comment. But where do you think the regulations around fracking and methane emissions, what does that mean for natural gas?
Well, we certainly hope that they're going to strengthen them. There has been some moves recently to strengthen some of those regulations, the so-called green completions rule and things like that, and there's more efforts underway. The Obama administration has a plan to reduce methane emissions from all sources, but particularly from natural gas, which I think is the largest source of methane emissions from production. And it's hard to say where it's going to go. I mean, I think some companies have already been deploying these technologies, but there's still quite a ways to go, and there's really a great deal of uncertainty actually in the research out there that estimates what the leakage rate is, going from anywhere from 1% of total natural gas production to 10% or more. And so there really needs to be a lot more work to kind of really nail down what the amount is and and to deploy technologies that we know about that are cost effective with fairly short payback periods to start capturing the emissions and actually using the gas for some productive use instead of releasing it to the atmosphere.
Right. So there are actually two more questions, and they're both related to pipeline. So one of the participants said that here in Virginia, large gas pipelines have been proposed to carry frack gas southward from West Virginia and Ohio, arguably for use in electricity generation in southern states or arguably for export. Any comments on the demand for gas in these states, and any sort of information about the necessity of this new gas infrastructure? And that, of course, relates to Florida. You already mentioned the Sable Palm new pipeline that's been proposed. And then related to that was another question about more of the pipeline infrastructure, and can the current infrastructure handle substantial expansion of natural gas? So I'll throw that to you.
I don't have a specific answer to that question, but I know that there is some work underway to look into what natural gas capacity we need. I know the Department of Energy is doing quite a bit of research around this issue. They put out a report not too long ago that as part of the quadrennial energy review that's really looking into how much natural gas infrastructure, pipeline infrastructure and capacity we need. And we met with some staff from DOE a couple of days ago, and the sort of high-level point they made was that the amount of additional infrastructure is not as much as what some people are claiming is needed to address future needs. And I think it also gets back to that point I made earlier in the presentation, which is we also need to be careful not to overbuild that infrastructure if in the future we need to actually reduce natural gas generation or usage to meet climate targets. And so that infrastructure, the money for that infrastructure could also go into additional transmission capacity, for example, to help build out renewables. And so there's important decisions that need to be made that weigh those types of things.
Yeah, precisely. Very good. So that is actually the end of our questions, and we're getting on the 2 o'clock hour. So, well, I had one more. All right, sorry, one more question because I want to get everybody. Putting aside escape gas from fracking, what is the average carbon reduction when a coal-fired power plant switches to natural gas? I'll let Steve do that, but I think we answered that. It's about half, right?
Yeah, I mean, the industry, when you see their commercials on TV, they talk about 50%. I think it could, using a state-of-the-art natural gas combined cycle plant could be as high as 60%, especially if you're replacing a much older coal plant that's fairly inefficient. So I think there's a little bit of a range, but I think it's somewhere in the order of 50 to 60% of the smokestack emissions could be reduced from moving from coal to gas. But keep in mind that over the long term, we need to reduce emissions on the order of 80% or more by 2050. So that ultimately means we're going to have to reduce emissions from natural gas generation as well. And the only way to really do that is through carbon capture and storage, or potentially through things like combined heat and power. So that once again, natural gas has an important role to play in the near term, but over the longer term, we actually need to go further and achieve deeper emission reductions.
Yeah, understandable. And then if you add, again, there's certainly argument about how much it is, but if you look at the methane emissions from the fracking of the gas, then you may not be making any progress there. One of the comments was that it was 50% compared to coal, but maybe 30% compared to liquid petroleum. So shows that that's in the transportation. And then there was one other comment about the current pipeline infrastructure where particularly in places like older cities like Boston, New York, and Chicago, where you have a common methane leaks and the billions of dollars that it would take to repair. And the question is, has anyone done a cost comparison between repair costs and promoting solar and wind? So, Steve, I'm going to let that for you or Sandra be our final question.
There is a blog that one of my colleagues, Mike Jacobs, wrote that's up on our website that kind of touches on that issue, that compares sort of the cost of building out the natural gas pipeline infrastructure to building out the transmission infrastructure for renewables. So if it doesn't completely answer your question, but it sort of gets at that issue if anyone wants to take a look.
Well, with that, Steve and Sandra, if you have a final question, I just think that this report is so very important. And again, as someone who went through a process in Florida, at one point we had 7 coal-fired power plant proposals, and natural gas, of course, is more desirable than that. But you know, sometimes even good things have a side problem, and the fact that if we go, and this appears to be the direction that both the utilities and the regulators in Florida seem to be heading, folks, with this new natural gas infrastructure in Florida and new gas plants that have been built and new gas plants that are pipeline, pun intended. But to meet our 38% reduction, the idea that Florida would be 92% reliant on natural gas is nothing short of frightening. So I appreciate this information. It was a timely report, and I think not something that a lot of organizations had focused on. So Sandra or Steve, is there a final word that you'd like to get in before we wrap up?
No, I just wanted to thank SACE again for hosting the webinar, and if anyone has additional questions, they can either contact SACE or us, and we'd be happy to try to address them or pass on any additional information that we talked about.
Yeah, thanks for giving us the opportunity to share this with you, and thanks for attending.
Great, thanks,
Yes,
Susan.
very good. I appreciate everyone spending a little bit of their day with us. Thanks.
Yep, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Steve and Sandra, and everybody else for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. Today's presentation has been recorded, and it will be available on the webinar archive page of our website, cleanenergy.org. We'll also be sending around a link to that recording once it has been processed. We appreciate your support and interest, and hope you'll join us again. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.